nothing else than a formalized statement, have an official policy of anti-discrimination or being willing to hire diverse groups. And this is just part of the sort of modern professional environment that we live in. But what these respondents argue is that when these sorts of organizational rules transform into actual training settings or diversity trainings or organizational retreats or what have you, where there is the expectation to talk about diversity, this is a particular context where they feel that they are particularly unable to follow the feeling rules that are available to their white coworkers. In other words, their white colleagues in these sorts of training sessions are able to speak very candidly about their experiences and their fears and their concerns about being in predominantly white settings with a few people of color in this experience, but that for people of color, black professionals in particular, there's much less ability to talk openly and freely about the experiences that they feel and the responses that they have about being in this setting. And there were a number of respondents who talked about this in a lot of detail, of feeling that it created a very uncomfortable situation for them if they have to go into a diversity training seminar and their colleagues are talking about how they were raised to not play with black children growing up and that they were always taught that black people were inferior and that it's very difficult for them to be in these work settings where they have to now actually work with one or two people of color, particularly if they are black people. This became a situation where these workers felt that there were definitely feeling rules in place that were not available to them, that they could not follow these feeling rules. So here's a quote from Yvette, who is 37 and a program director, who speaks to the sort of consequences of not following these feeling rules in the sense that she's not able to speak as candidly as her white coworkers. And Yvette describes, when I interviewed her, she was a program job, but she was telling me about an experience in a past job where she was working in sales. So she says, this was a sales job. One woman said point blank that she was afraid of dark-skinned black people, so she didn't really want to try to sell things to them. We would have teams selling things, but we had a team in Atlanta with no black people on it, teams selling in San Francisco with no Asians. It was ridiculous, and I said so. I told them I didn't like what I was hearing, that it bothered me, and that I thought that we needed to change the racial climate if we wanted to improve. Well, you can guess what happened. The next week they called me into the office, told me I was too sensitive, and I got fired. So again, this is another important quote to include, and the reason why I selected this one is because it shows, I think, pretty clearly this contrast between what he felt that she was experiencing and what she felt that her white coworkers were allowed to do versus what she was allowed to do. That she describes this experience of sitting in this training seminar where people are talking openly about their fears and their concerns and their misgivings about working in a relatively integrated environment, but that when she speaks openly and honestly, her feeling is that this led directly to her termination. So this is an important quote, I think, because not only does it highlight this contrast between her perception of what happened to her versus what happened to others, but it also shows one consequence for workers of color when these feeling rules are not followed. When Yvette doesn't follow the feeling rule in this particular case, the feeling rule that she feels is applied to black professionals in particular, she ends up out of a job, according to her analysis of the situation. So I think it's important because this shows really these consequences, or what some of these consequences can be for black professionals who in some cases choose to challenge the feeling rules instead of conforming to them. And this isn't a consistent case because I just did give a quote about black women professionals who chose to challenge the feeling rules of being angry in some cases and who still were able to maintain their jobs. But I think it does warrant further research in terms of analyzing what the particulars are of following the feeling rules and whether or not it actually serves to help black professionals to follow these feeling rules or what the consequences are for them if they choose to challenge them. Ultimately, the conclusions that I draw from this study are that tokenism seems to extend to the feeling rules that black professionals are able to follow. That this experience of being one of few, this experience of being highly visible, this experience of being stereotyped, of facing marginalization, of facing lowered expectations from coworkers, this experience of being in the numerical minority, does seem to really have an impact on the way in which black workers feel that they are able to follow the feeling rules that are present in the organizational context, on whether or not they're able to follow feeling rules to the same extent as their white colleagues, or whether or not they're even able to have access to the same sorts of feeling rules as their white colleagues. Ultimately, black workers find themselves scrutinized not only for what they do, but for how they feel, which is an important contribution to the research on tokenism, which heretofore has only focused really on behaviors and outcomes. That black workers are scrutinized for what they do and how they behave, but not necessarily that the research has gone so far as to look at what this means for the type of emotional performance that they communicate in the work setting. I argue that because this dynamic appears to be in place, ultimately ultimately, this serves to reproduce a form of racial inequality in modern professional workplaces. That if black workers are finding themselves in a position where they are being carefully scrutinized for the types of emotions that they demonstrate and for the types of emotions that they don't demonstrate, then this puts on them this added burden of doing additional emotional labor or additional emotion work that isn't necessarily present for their white colleagues, which goes back to Hochschild's initial arguments about the kind of the drawback of emotional labor in the first place. Her initial point was that this created an additional barrier, an additional imbalance between women and men in professional workplace, or in the modern workplace. I also argue that this finding changes our understanding of emotional labor. If emotional labor is grounded on our assessments of feeling rules, if feeling rules themselves are non-neutral but actually racialized concepts, then this is going to shape the way in which we understand how emotional work is actually done. So for example, I referenced a study earlier about the experiences of black professors, and I referenced the study's finding that black professors end up doing sort of an emotional management in response to expectations of students and student responses to their qualifications and capabilities and so forth. But if professors' evaluations are tied to things like student evaluations and student assessments of their performances, and black professors feel that they have to conform to these particular feeling rules, they may find themselves doing actual examples of work to bring their emotions in line with particular feelings in order to get the necessary evaluations that they need in order to keep their jobs. So I argue that this actually can shift the way that we understand this concept of emotional labor, such that it may take on racialized undertones that are not necessarily present or accounted for in the existing research. Finally, I think it's important to highlight the ways that the experience of tokenism is shaped by tokens' race and or gender. And this is a point that other researchers have addressed in various ways in following up on Cantor's original token hypothesis. That Cantor argued in her initial work that the token experience was driven simply by being in the numerical minority. I find, as other scholars have argued in different ways previously, that this is simply too broad of a generalization, that the experience of tokenization is going to shift depending on whether the token in question is an African American woman or an African American male or a Latino male or a Latino woman, but that these intersections of race and gender are going to mean different experiences for the token. In other words, we can't just assume that someone in the token experience is going to have the same experiences as a woman who's in a male-dominated corporation. Her experience may not necessarily look the same as the African American woman who's in a white male-dominated workplace, or the African American woman who works in an environment predominantly comprised of black males or Asian American males or what have you. These intersections of race and gender play a very important role in shaping the ways that the token experiences are manifested, not only in terms of behavior, but in terms of the actual emotional performance. So I'll end just by saying that I titled my piece, as I should become much more clear having heard the entire discussion, about raising this question of whether or not some emotions are actually marked whites only. And it's sort of a hyperbolic title because obviously emotions can't clearly come with a sign on them, but I think that it does communicate this idea that emotional performance in some ways, particularly in professional workplaces, may not necessarily be equally available and equivalent for all workers in the professional environment, such that emotions can actually become an additional area where racial inequality is reproduced when black workers find themselves in the token position and unable to access the same sorts of emotional performances as their colleagues across the racial spectrum. Thank you. Okay. I can take questions if there are any.
Did you notice any correlation between the ages, like for Kima, she was 43 and Jay was 25, and their reactions? Do you think that also had a role in it besides their gender?
I didn't notice correlations across ages in terms of the sort of responses that people had about the sort of emotional labor that they had to do or the connections to feeling rules. What I did notice, kind of interestingly, was a lot more, I guess, openly expressed frustration with younger people. That I had a pretty wide span of ages, but that in thinking about it now, the older respondents that I spoke to, I guess, seemed maybe sort of more world weary about the experiences that they had and were more likely to just say, you know, yeah, this happens, but this is the way it is. Whereas, as if you'll notice with Jay's comment and with Teresa's comment earlier, there's a lot of kind of frustration. This came through very clearly in the interviews and maybe less so with the quotes, but there was a lot of real just dissatisfaction and disassociation with the work that they were doing, and a lot of aggravation and annoyance with it. So I'm not sure if that speaks to being newer in the workforce and having sort of less time to develop coping mechanisms and coping skills over the long term than perhaps their more seasoned coworkers had, or if it speaks to expectations that once they got into the workforce they would be experiencing something different than maybe the expectations that older generations of black workers have had. I'm not really sure, and I haven't looked into that, but I think it is an interesting thing to point out, and that is definitely an area where I did see some differences in terms of the level of vehemence and frustration and just real feelings of being upset that these workers did use to talk about their work experiences.
How do you plan on furthering your research?
Actually, I'm conducting a study now that's at the early writing stages that's looking specifically at black professional men's experiences in predominantly white male-dominated occupations. So I'm looking at black men who have been employed as lawyers, doctors, bankers, and engineers. I've found that, as I said, my research is really grounded in these questions of intersections of race and gender in modern professional workplaces. And this is really an area that's been pretty largely untapped. There's been a lot of research on black professionals broadly, but not a lot that looks at how these intersecting factors of race and gender have an impact on black men in particular. So this is an area that I'm trying to fill with this research. I hope to have enough data. I'm done with data collection now, and as I said, I'm beginning the writing stages, and I hope to have enough data to turn into a book project. And I do want to have a chapter in there that talks about the sort of emotion work and emotion management that black professional men are expected to do in this context, just to make an argument about how this differs from the experiences of black professional women, which have been really very well documented. I saw your hand first, and then
Did you ever encounter any professionals that were used to it, or that just thought that this wasn't a problem? Or did everybody have a problem with it, or did you encounter anybody that was like, well, I mean, it's been going on so long, so I'm just kind of used to it?
I wouldn't say that I encountered anyone who didn't feel that it was a problem. The closest that I came to that, the closest that I came to that is kind of interesting. People who might start off the interview by saying, no, I wouldn't say that I really had any racial incidents at work, and then with further questions would say, well, actually, this happened where this person said this to me, and this happened where this person said this to me, and then this happened where this other thing occurred. And then this other thing happened, which, I didn't sort of confront them on the contradiction in saying that you didn't have any problems, but then you just listed 4 or 5 for me. But I think that there were people who might have started out the interview that way, who drew out and enumerated the types of problems that they did have over the course of the interview. But I did have some people who, as I said, were, I guess, more seasoned and more resigned to the sorts of experiences that they were having. And as I was saying in response to her question, these tended to be workers who were older. That the workers that I spoke to who were in later middle age, in their 60s, and a couple of people in their late 50s, definitely talked with much more of a sense of resignation about, this is what happens. And I had a lot, particularly with older workers, I had a lot of people who would make sort of lifetime comparisons and would say, yeah, this is annoying, but I've seen worse. So there's always that to put it in the context that, yes, it bothers me when I go into my office and people give me their trash buckets to empty, or people try not to let me on the elevator because they don't know that I work there even if I've had the office next to them for years, and I get mad and that makes me frustrated. But what are you going to do? It could be worse, because I remember back when I was younger in the 1950s when I couldn't even come into this office. So I definitely did have more of that sort of comparative analysis, I think, from older workers.
Have you ever experienced it?
Oh. What an interesting question. Not exactly in the ways that some of my respondents have, but I think that a lot of the responses that they gave are pretty familiar to black professional workers in predominantly white environments. I have not had experiences that were as severe as some of my respondents, but I think that there is often a sense, again, being a person who's a numerical and a racial and a gender minority, at least in my field and in my office, of having this experience where there are certain emotions that would not be prurient to display at work, and that they are better saved for when you're at home with family and friends, or talking to colleagues in other departments, or at conferences when you need to get away for a coffee or what have you. There's definitely this awareness that there's a sense that these are things that are better shared sort of in private context than in public context. But I think that's an interesting question, because the universality of it, I think, goes back to sort of the broader issue, right? If there's this general sense among black professionals that these are the things that you know it's best to share off-site, or best to share with people that you trust, or best just not to communicate in the work environment. This goes back to reproducing the same sort of structural imbalance in the workplace, right? If there's a sense among people of different professions and people in different backgrounds that you know that these are the things that you can't talk about